15 black legends whose marriages ended in betrayal, scandal, and heartbreak. What if some of the most admired black legends in history were hiding heartbreak far more painful than the world ever imagined? Behind the fame, the awards, the sold-out crowds, and the untouchable public image were marriages filled with betrayal, humiliation, emotional collapse, and private battles no spotlight could soften. Some of these stories will shock you. Others may completely change how you see the men you thought you knew. And as this list goes on, the truth only gets darker. Before we begin, subscribe to Cine Legacy Vault Hollywood, because this channel goes beyond the headlines to uncover the hidden pain, the broken trust, and the untold stories behind Hollywood's biggest icons. Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was never just a boxer. He was a force of nature, a man who turned victory into theater and conviction into legend. He dazzled the world with speed, courage, and a voice so fearless it could shake stadiums before the first punch was thrown. From his historic rise in the ring to his transformation into a global symbol of resistance, Ali lived larger than almost anyone of his time. He was admired not only for defeating champions, but for refusing to bow when the cost of standing firm became enormous. To millions, he looked invincible. He looked like a man built to survive anything. But that is exactly why the collapse of his early marriage hit with such force. At the moment when his life was changing faster than most people could understand, his private world was already pulling in the opposite direction. He had fame, spiritual conviction, and worldwide attention pressing down on him all at once. Yet the relationship beside him was becoming more unstable by the day. What seemed exciting at first soon turned into a clash of values, lifestyle, and emotional expectation. Instead of finding peace at home, Ali found another battleground, one that demanded energy he could barely spare while fighting public wars over faith identity and the future of his career. But tell me this: what hurts more, losing a title or losing trust when you need it most? That question sits at the center of his story. Muhammad Ali was a man the public saw as endlessly strong, but strength in public does not guarantee safety in private. His marriage became one more pressure point in a life already stretched by scrutiny, sacrifice, and conflict. That is what makes this chapter so compelling. It reminds us that even a man powerful enough to stand against governments and silence arenas with his presence could still be wounded in the one place he may have hoped to feel secure. Behind the brilliance, behind the poetry, behind the glory, there was still a man capable of heartbreak. Ray Charles. Ray Charles carried greatness in a way that felt almost supernatural. Blind from childhood, he still became one of the defining architects of American music, blending gospel, blues, jazz, and soul into a sound so original that it changed the emotional vocabulary of popular culture. He did not simply sing songs. He made pain sound elegant, desire sound spiritual, and loneliness sound almost holy. That is why his private life feels so haunting when placed beside his public triumph. A man who could give the world that much feeling still could not protect himself from heartbreak inside his own home. What makes this chapter of his life so painful is that it began with the promise of refuge. He did not choose glamour. He chose someone who seemed grounded, someone removed from the chaos of show business, someone who looked as if she might bring order to a life constantly pulled apart by fame, touring, and temptation. But over time, the marriage shifted from sanctuary to strain. Distance widened. Money became a source of tension. Trust began to decay. The deeper the public admired Ray Charles as a genius, the more his personal life seemed to harden into resentment, secrecy, and emotional fatigue. He was giving audiences unforgettable music while carrying disappointment he could not perform away. And let me ask you this: what happens when the one place a man hoped would give him peace becomes the very place that drains it? That question gives Ray Charles's story its emotional power. He already lived with the demands of addiction, travel, financial pressure, and artistic expectation. A collapsing marriage did not arrive in an empty life. It struck a man already fighting multiple battles at once. That is why the wound felt so deep. Ray's pain was not loud in public. He kept moving, kept playing, kept building the legend. But behind the dark glasses and the timeless voice was a man learning that success can fill theaters without ever guaranteeing safety at home. Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy ruled comedy with a confidence so complete that it made success look effortless. From stand-up stages to blockbuster films, he moved with speed instinct and a kind of natural command that few entertainers in any era have ever matched. He was funny, magnetic, commercially unstoppable, and for a long stretch of time, he looked like a man who had mastered the game. That is why the breakdown of his marriage hit differently. When someone seems that powerful in public, people assume the private world must be under control as well. But fame often hides disorder more effectively than it prevents it. What makes Eddie's story especially compelling is the contrast between the fantasy and the unraveling. To the public, he appeared to have built the dream wealth children estate's visibility and a family image polished enough to fit the mythology of Hollywood success. But the deeper truth suggested by this story is harsher. Long absences, pressure, mistrust, and the corrosive loneliness that can grow inside a highly visible marriage began to reshape everything. Once suspicion enters a household already weakened by distance, even luxury starts to feel unstable. In Eddie's case, the public did not just watch a couple separate. They watched the collapse of an image that had once looked almost untouchable. So let me ask you this. What does a man really lose when the marriage falls apart after the world has already decided he has everything? That question sits at the center of Eddie Murphy's story. The damage was never only about money, though the financial consequences were severe. It was also about silence weariness and the realization that private fractures do not disappear just because the cameras love you. Eddie kept working. He kept rebuilding. He kept giving performances strong enough to remind people why he mattered. But the emotional cost of a broken home lingers differently for men who are expected to laugh their way through everything. In that sense, his story is not just about divorce. It is about the lonely side of fame that no applause can fix. Lionel Richie. Lionel Richie made romance sound smooth, effortless, and eternal. His voice floated through the 1980s like a promise that love, if sung beautifully enough, could survive almost anything. That public image became part of his power. He was not only a hitmaker, he was the soundtrack to weddings, reconciliations, longing, and emotional fantasy. So when the narrative of his marriage fractured, it carried a special sting. A man who gave the world polished devotion suddenly found his own domestic life exposed as tense, divided, and deeply unstable. What makes Lionel's story so gripping is the collision between intimacy and spectacle. For years, the marriage appeared rooted, mature, and dependable. The outside looked controlled. But the pressures building beneath it were connected to exactly the forces that make fame so dangerous: absence, temptation, emotional neglect, and the split between public image and private conduct. Once another woman entered the picture, the entire emotional architecture collapsed in public. The betrayal did not remain a whisper. It became a headline, an arrest, a scandal, and a permanent stain on what had once looked like a respectable family story. In a case like this, the marriage does not just end, it detonates. And let me ask you this, how much damage is done when the man selling love songs can no longer keep love stable in his own life? That question gives Lionel Richie's story its resonance. This was never only about infidelity or divorce, it was about what happens when a carefully built emotional image cracks in front of the world. The fallout touched reputation, family, fatherhood, and the public's belief in the tenderness he had spent years singing about. He kept performing. He kept smiling. He kept sounding like Lionel Richie. But stories like this remind us that charm on stage does not guarantee harmony at home. Sometimes it only makes the contrast more painful. O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson once represented a version of American success that seemed almost untouchable. He had sports glory, commercial appeal, television charm, and the kind of public familiarity that turns an athlete into a national brand. For a long time, he was not merely famous. He was culturally accepted in spaces where many black men before him had not been welcomed so easily. That is why the collapse of his personal life became so much bigger than an ordinary celebrity scandal. When his marriage spiraled, it dragged not only a household into chaos, but an entire public image into permanent ruin. What makes this story so disturbing is the escalation. It does not move like a typical unhappy marriage. It grows darker with every stage. Attraction becomes possession. Conflict becomes fear. Divorce fails to create distance. Jealousy mutates into fixation. And eventually, the relationship stops feeling like a domestic tragedy and starts reading like a full public warning. In O.J.'s case, what gives the story its terrible force is that the emotional instability did not remain private. It crossed into violence, surveillance, obsession, and finally one of the most infamous murder cases in American memory. Once that line is crossed, the marriage is no longer just broken. It becomes part of a national nightmare. So let me ask you this. When love turns into control, how long does it take before the whole world can see the danger except the people trapped inside it? That question sits at the heart of O.J. Simpson's story. He matters here because he represents the most extreme form of what happens when ego, entitlement, and emotional instability are allowed to grow unchecked inside an intimate relationship. The public did not just watch a famous man fall. They watched a version of celebrity power reveal its ugliest underside. In that sense, this is not a story about glamour gone wrong. It is a story about how charisma can hide menace until the damage becomes irreversible. Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones belonged to a rare class of men whose influence was larger than their visibility. Even when he was not in the frame, his taste, judgment, and musical architecture shaped what the frame became. He was not just successful, he was foundational. That gives his personal story a different emotional tone from performers whose pain unfolds through public persona. Quincy's power lived in refinement, intelligence, and world-making. So when trust breaks inside the private sphere, the damage feels less explosive and more devastatingly dissonant. A man who could orchestrate greatness for others could not necessarily create harmony in his own home. What makes this story especially compelling is the contrast between what the marriage represented and what it became. On the surface, it looked historic, progressive, sophisticated, a union people could project social meaning onto. But relationships built under public symbolism can hide private imbalance for years. Money status, longing, and emotional drift do not disappear simply because the outside world sees the pairing as important. In Quincy's case, the hurt seems to come not from one loud collapse, but from the slow realization that affection, admiration, and family could still be overtaken by material strain and breach of trust. That kind of heartbreak is quieter, but often deeper. So let me ask you this. What does betrayal sound like in the life of a man who spent decades turning chaos into music? That question gives Quincy Jones's story its lasting power. He was a master of arrangement, but private life does not always follow structure. Love can go off-key even in the hands of someone who understands balance better than almost anyone alive. That is why this chapter matters. It shows that brilliance in public cannot guarantee clarity in private. And for a man whose work defined emotional precision, the disorder of failed intimacy may have been one of the hardest notes to live with at all. James Brown. James Brown moved through American music like a live wire. He did not simply perform songs. He attacked them with force, sweat rhythm, and authority, until the stage itself seemed too small to contain him. He was discipline and chaos in one body, a man who could bend a room to his will through sheer energy. That is what made his private life feel so tragic in contrast. A figure who looked unstoppable in public was living inside a relationship defined by instability, excess, and emotional combustion. The farther he climbed as an icon, the less peace seemed to exist behind the curtain. What makes this chapter so dark is that the marriage did not merely suffer from ordinary strain. It became a vortex. Parties, substances, suspicion, arguments, and mutual volatility kept feeding each other until love seemed less like a bond and more like a trap. No one inside it knew how to leave. In stories like this, the pain is not clean. It is repetitive, humiliating, and draining. Every attempt to recover dignity gets swallowed by another fight, another indulgence, another financial wound. For a man whose whole career projected command, that loss of control cut especially deep. He could command a crowd, but not a home. So let me ask you this. What breaks a man faster, public pressure or a private life that never lets him exhale? That question sits at the center of James Brown's story. His marriage mattered not because it was glamorous, but because it mirrored the same extremes that shaped his art intensity: restlessness, danger, and self-destruction. The emotional damage did not come from one moment alone. It came from accumulation. Day after day, scene after scene, the relationship kept grinding him down. That is why this part of his life still feels so heavy. James Brown sang about feeling good, but the man behind that anthem was wrestling with a domestic storm that fame, money, and talent could not calm. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye sang as if he were confessing directly into the listener's bloodstream. Few artists ever turned vulnerability into music with the same elegance, and that is why his private heartbreak still feels fused to his legacy. He was not merely a singer. He was a vessel for longing, spiritual exhaustion, sensuality, and emotional fracture. So when his marriage became a battlefield of power, silence, and unresolved pain, it did more than damage his personal life. It seeped into the art itself. With Marvin Gaye, you cannot fully separate the man from the ache in the music because he kept turning private wreckage into sound. What makes this story so compelling is that the relationship was entangled with ambition as much as affection. It was not a simple love story gone wrong. It was also about hierarchy, dependence, approval, and the emotional cost of living inside someone else's orbit while trying to build your own. As the years went on, the marriage stopped feeling like a union and started feeling like a weight. Secrets made it heavier. Mistrust made it colder. Money made it crueler. And by the time the ending came, it did not sound like relief. It sounded like a wound torn open so deeply that even music had to carry it. So let me ask you this. When a man turns heartbreak into art, does the masterpiece prove he healed, or only that he was hurt enough to make it unforgettable? That question defines Marvin Gaye's story. His marriage did not just leave him broken emotionally. It helped shape one of the most nakedly revealing musical responses to divorce ever recorded. That alone tells you how deep the damage went. Marvin mattered because he could make feeling audible, but that gift came at a cost. In his case, love was not the safe place beneath the songs. It was often the fire behind them, and that is why his story still lingers. The beauty of the music does not erase the pain, it preserves it. Smokey Robinson. Smokey Robinson made romance sound delicate, graceful, almost impossibly refined. His songs floated rather than announced themselves. They moved through heartbreak with silk instead of thunder, and that gave him an emotional signature unlike anyone else in Motown. He seemed to understand the quiet side of longing better than most men ever put into words. That is why the erosion of his marriage feels so striking. A man whose art was built on emotional subtlety found himself trapped in a relationship that did not explode all at once. It thinned, cooled, and deteriorated in slow motion. What makes his story so compelling is the absence of spectacle. Some marriages collapse in fire. This one, as told here, seems to wear away through disappointment, fatigue, distance, and the grinding loss of tenderness. That kind of unraveling can be even more painful because it leaves no dramatic ending to point at only a long trail of moments when love stopped feeling safe and started feeling transactional. Miscarriages, mistrust money, emotional drift, and the suspicion that something essential had already been lost created a home that no longer sounded like the lyrics he was singing. The contrast is what makes it linger. So let me ask you this. What hurts more, one great betrayal or the quiet realization that love has been dying in front of you for years? That question gives Smokey Robinson's story its weight. He was a master of emotional nuance, and that may be why this kind of damage feels especially cruel in his case. He could write devotion beautifully, but real life does not always offer the closure a song can. The marriage ended, the money was split, and the image of the golden couple disappeared. But the sadness remained because nothing about the loss was simple. It was gradual, intimate, and spiritually exhausting. And that is why this story resonates. Sometimes the marriages that look the calmest from the outside leave the deepest internal silence when they end. Gary Coleman. Gary Coleman's story hits differently because the fragility was visible long before the marriage entered the picture. He had been famous, exploited, diminished, and emotionally cornered by life almost from the beginning. That changes the tone of everything that came later. He was not moving into adulthood from a position of strength and privacy. He was carrying illness, financial depletion, public ridicule, and the residue of a stolen childhood. So when a relationship entered that already wounded landscape and brought more volatility, humiliation, and conflict, it did not feel like ordinary heartbreak. It felt like one more layer of extraction from a life that had already been mined too deeply. What makes this chapter so devastating is that it seems to take vulnerability and turn it into theater. Arguments become public. Suffering becomes spectacle. Weakness becomes leverage. A man who had already spent years being treated as less powerful than his fame suggested now appears trapped in a relationship where care, dependence, resentment, and control are twisted together. In stories like this, the emotional damage is not only in the fights, it is in the indignity. It is in the feeling that the person at the center no longer has full authority over his own life image or even final wishes. So let me ask you this. What is left of a person's dignity when the people closest to him start treating his pain like something they can manage, display, or profit from? That question is why Gary Coleman's story feels so painful. This was never just about a failed relationship. It was about exploitation returning in a new form at the point in life when he most needed protection. The marriage did not occur in isolation. It landed on a man already exhausted by the world. And that is what gives the story its tragic force. Gary brought joy to millions, but the later years suggest a life in which safety, tenderness, and genuine loyalty were much harder to find than fame ever was. Miles Davis. Miles Davis made reinvention look like instinct. He did not follow music. He cornered it, stripped it down, and forced it to become something new. That is part of why his private life feels so difficult to watch in contrast. A man who could constantly evolve artistically still remained vulnerable to old wounds in love. He was brilliant, severe, stylish, fragile, and emotionally difficult all at once. That complexity gave his art its edge, but it also meant his relationships were never likely to be simple. In his case, intimacy seems to have arrived carrying not comfort, but pressure. What makes this marriage so striking is the collision between two highly visible legacies. It did not look like a small or ordinary union. It looked symbolic, almost monumental. But symbolism can be dangerous inside a relationship because it invites people to admire the image while missing the strain. Here, the story moves through suspicion, financial stress, emotional withdrawal, and the bitterness that grows when two strong identities cannot create softness together. Miles does not come across as merely betrayed. He comes across as someone who may have wanted salvation and instead found another form of tension. That distinction matters. It adds sadness to the collapse. So let me ask you this. What happens when two extraordinary people create something the world calls powerful, but privately it feels impossible to live inside? That question gives Miles Davis's story its lingering ache. The relationship mattered because it carried the promise of healing, maturity, and mutual stature. When that promise broke down, the disappointment cut deeper than a casual failure ever could. Miles had already spent a lifetime wrestling with addiction, illness, ego, and silence. A marriage that became another site of emotional fracture did not just hurt him. It hardened something in him. And that is why the story still resonates. Not because it was loud, but because it seems to have left a bruise on a man who had already survived too much. Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron carried history on his back with a level of grace that almost concealed the violence of what he endured. He was not just chasing records. He was moving through American racism, public hostility, and the unbearable pressure of becoming a symbol in real time. That alone would have been enough to exhaust almost anyone. So what makes the collapse of his marriage so affecting is the timing. It arrived not in a quiet season, but as he stood under a national spotlight already hot enough to scorch him. Home should have been the place where the noise stopped. Instead, according to this story, it became another place where trust failed him. What gives this chapter its sadness is the image of a man fighting on two fronts at once. In public, he had to remain dignified through hatred. In private, he was allegedly facing emotional distance, financial drain, and the humiliation of possible betrayal. Those wounds strike differently because they come at the precise moment when support matters most. Greatness often looks lonely from the outside, but Aaron's story suggests it can become lonelier still when the person returning home no longer knows whether home is solid ground. That idea is devastating. A man facing history should not also have to fear collapse in his own life. So let me ask you this. How much can one person carry before even triumph starts to feel heavy instead of joyful? That question defines Hank Aaron's emotional arc here. His marriage matters because it turns a heroic public journey into something more fragile and human. He was not only a record breaker, he was a husband, a father, and a man expected to absorb extraordinary stress without breaking. The tragedy in stories like this is not always spectacular. Sometimes it is the quiet damage done while the world is cheering. Aaron still made history, but the story suggests he paid for that greatness in more ways than the crowd ever understood. Al Green. Al Green sounded like tenderness itself. Few voices in soul music ever carried softness with such force, and that made his later personal turmoil feel almost spiritually disorienting. He gave people songs for reconciliation, intimacy, devotion, and quiet longing. He made love sound both earthly and sacred. So when his private life became a source of conflict control and emotional depletion, the contrast was severe. The man whose music suggested calm connection was living through a marriage that seems in this telling to have pulled him farther and farther away from peace. What makes Al's story especially resonant is the clash between spiritual change and domestic strain. He was not merely a star dealing with a troubled marriage. He was a man trying to transform himself inwardly, while the relationship around him remained driven by tension, demand, and unresolved grievance. That split matters because it turns the story into more than a celebrity breakup. It becomes a conflict between the life someone is trying to build and the life still gripping him from the outside. Money complicates it, public accusation deepens it, and the emotional exhaustion becomes harder to escape because it follows him into both art and faith. So let me ask you this. How does a man search for spiritual peace when the closest relationship in his life keeps pulling him back into turmoil? That question gives Al Green's story its ache. His marriage did not simply end in legal paperwork. It left behind a residue that touched reputation, confidence, and direction. Even if he moved toward another chapter, the shadow remained. That is why this story lands. It shows that reinvention is difficult enough on its own, but almost impossible when home is still a battlefield. Al Green sang like a man who understood lasting love. This story suggests how much harder it is to live than to sing. Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman lived as if ordinary rules were written for someone else. On the court, he was disciplined chaos, an athlete whose body seemed wired for collision, sacrifice, and disruption. Off the court, he turned unpredictability into identity. That made him fascinating, but it also made stability difficult to recognize when it appeared. In a life already built on extremes, a fast-burning marriage did not arrive as an exception. It arrived almost as a continuation. That is what makes this story so volatile. The relationship did not merely fall apart. It seemed to accelerate toward destruction at the exact speed both lives were already moving. What gives this chapter its emotional charge is how quickly spectacle replaced intimacy. The wedding itself felt like impulse made public. Then came shouting police broken property injury and the kind of chaos that celebrity culture devours because it can package it as entertainment. But what sits underneath is not entertaining at all. It is instability feeding instability. Two people entering a union with more chemistry than foundation, more performance than trust, and more heat than structure. In those situations, passion does not save anything. It only makes the crash louder. So let me ask you this. When two people are drawn together by intensity alone, was the relationship ever built to survive once the spotlight moved in? That question gives Dennis Rodman's story its meaning. He matters here because he embodies how fame can confuse adrenaline for compatibility. The marriage was short, but short does not mean small. Sometimes the briefest unions leave the longest aftershocks, especially when money, media, and instability are all involved. Rodman's story lingers because it feels like a warning about velocity itself. Not every whirlwind is romance. Some are just wreckage arriving early. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke had the kind of voice that made hope sound intimate. He did not just sing beautifully. He made longing feel close enough to touch, and that gift turned him into one of the great emotional architects of American music. His songs carried tenderness, but also vision. He stood at the crossroads of gospel discipline and secular possibility, and in doing so, he redefined what a black artist could become in the mainstream. That is why the collapse around his personal life feels so tragic. A man who gave the culture so much beauty left behind a private story tangled in betrayal, scandal, and bitterness that outlived him. What makes Sam's chapter especially haunting is that the damage did not end with his death. In many stories, tragedy closes the book. Here it seems to reopen everything. Rumor becomes humiliation, grief becomes spectacle, loyalty becomes impossible to trust. The emotional center of the story is not just the marriage itself, but what happened after the singer was gone and could no longer defend his name, his legacy, or the meaning of the life he had built. That gives the narrative a cruel afterlife. The wound did not stop bleeding when he died. It kept spreading through family inheritance, memory, and public outrage. So let me ask you this. What does betrayal become when it survives? The man it was done to. That question is the key to why Sam Cooke's story lingers. He is not remembered only because he was wronged, but because the contrast is almost unbearable. Here was a man whose music offered love, dignity, and moral weight, yet the story attached to his personal life became one of chaos after the grave. That is what makes it so painful. Sam Cooke did not just leave behind songs. He left behind a silence others rushed to fill, and in that silence the wreckage grew louder than it ever should have. What if some of the most admired black legends in history were hiding heartbreak far more painful than the world ever imagined? Behind the fame, the awards, the sold-out crowds, and the untouchable public image were marriages filled with betrayal, humiliation, emotional collapse, and private battles no spotlight could soften. Some of these stories will shock you. Others may completely change how you see the men you thought you knew. And as this list goes on, the truth only gets darker. Before we begin, subscribe to Cine Legacy Vault Hollywood, because this channel goes beyond the headlines to uncover the hidden pain, the broken trust, and the untold stories behind Hollywood's biggest icons.